Hey everybody out there in Learning Land. Today we're going to be talking about this issue of the sovereign state. And we've created a government because of the social contract, but now we need to talk about what do those governments start to look like, or what do those regions start to look like once we've bound together. What is this idea of the state, and what does this whole idea start to form into in terms of our government? So have your note sheet out if you've got this, and we'll just keep going through these pieces. Really what we look at are four features of a state, and those four features are true everywhere we look. The first one is population, and population is a body of people. Obviously, we looked at the idea of a social contract. You've got those body of people, you've got them bound together. Now the body of people that we're talking about is forming a state. You can't have a state without a population. You can't have a state without a population and a territory. The territory is those people living in a defined space. And probably one of the most important key parts is sovereignty. Those people living in a defined space that have the power to make and enforce the law, and here's the key part, without having to check with any higher authority. If there's a higher authority that they answer to, meaning another state, another country, another lawmaking body, then technically that isn't a state by the definition political scientists give. So we've got the body of people living in a defined space with the power to make and enforce laws on their own, not answering to anybody else. And then finally, they form a government, which is an organized group of people within all of these pieces here. Now that you have that information, what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at the graphic organizer that we gave to you and that you have for this and fill these things out. But also take a look at the reading on the characteristics of a state to help you fill in the blanks. That's going to be something that we need to have done at the end of this, so make sure that you've got all of those pieces ready to go. You should really be able to, after you're done with this module, you should be able to define a state. You should be able to define each of those pieces, and then the subgroups under each of those are the important parts too, because that's really what gives meaning to what we're talking about here. So we'll do a little quick quiz. Is that a state? Looking at those four characteristics that we talked about that make up a state, we want to ask the question, is it a state? So, is the United States just one big state? Well, to look at that, we have to be able to answer, does it have a population? Well, yes, we know that it has a population. Does it have a territory? Yes, we have defined borders and defined regions, that's a territory. Does it have sovereignty? Does it answer to anybody higher or another government higher than the United States? It doesn't answer to anybody higher, so we have sovereignty. And does it have a form of government? Does it have a system of government? Of course, yes. So when we look at that idea, the United States is a state. Now, what about the word state when we refer to it like Connecticut or Georgia? Well, all right, do they have a distinct population? Yes. Do they have a territory? Absolutely. We know what those borders are. Do they have sovereignty? In other words, are they the only authority that they need to answer to? Well, that's where it's different. No. And do they have a government? Yes, of course they have a government. We know that they are state governments. See, the thing is, the 50 states can't make laws that go against the Constitution, and those 50 states then are not sovereign. That's one of the beauties of our system, is our national government doesn't allow state governments to do whatever they want. There is some control that they exert over each state. So states do have a higher authority above them, so technically they're not sovereign. They're sovereign in certain spheres that we'll look at, but they're not sovereign in all spheres. So a little bit of a review. When we look at the four characteristics of a state, we talk about population, territory, sovereignty, and government. And again, it could be a large or small population, but there have to be people. It has to be inhabited. Every state has to have some recognized borders. The sovereignty piece is that they have absolute power within the territory. In other words, Kansas can't decide to make something a law that goes against the national law. We aren't sovereign in that sense. We are not a state in the political science definition. And then, of course, there's a mechanism of government to enforce policies. Something to consider, though, is that when we look at the changing nature of our country and the changing reality of our state, it's very, very, very important to consider that the projections put 2044 saying that no group is going to constitute a majority. No racial group, no ethnic group, no group at all is going to constitute a majority. Will be a pluralistic society. And that diversity is going to be very, very important because how we handle that as a state is really going to be the mark of where we are as a state. There's a lot of different historical pieces. You might remember this from a world history or U.S. history class, but when we look at the theories and the origins of the state, something to think about is think about all those states that were created by force. States that were created because the population submitted to the leader. Much like Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan, this would be the theory of the force creating the state. There's a huge history in terms of how a state's been created under the divine right of kings, that God is giving the power to that king. Then there's the evolutionary theory that says families form governments and families settle into a territory and families become a hereditary state and a sovereign state. But the one that we want to look at the most as a framework for the United States is the social contract theory. And this idea that the population has given power to a government that wants to promote the well-being of everybody, and they create a sovereign state as a result.